In March of 1899, a young woman of 19 died upon a ward at Leavesden Asylum in Hertfordshire, and her sickness had at first been taken for one more case of the fever, then passing through the building. It was some days, and the chance survival of a scrap of wrapping paper, before anyone suggested that her death had been anything other than illness. The woman later accused of causing that death was Mary Ann Ansell. She was, by most accounts, 21 or 22 years old, though some reports of the day put her younger, and she was the elder sister of the woman who had died. She was in service in London, a domestic maid in a household in Bloomsbury, and she had never before come to the notice of the police. The case that followed her would be tried in 2 days at the summer Assizes, and it would then do something that few criminal cases of the century managed to do. It would be raised 3 separate times on the floor of the House of Commons. The Hertfordshire in which the death occurred was a county of market towns, an open country north of London, and the institution at the centre of this case stood at Abbots Langley, a few miles from Watford. Leavesden Asylum had been built by the Metropolitan Asylums Board and opened in 1870, raised to house those whom the founding documents of the period called, in the institutional language of the time, quiet and harmless imbeciles. It was a vast establishment. By the end of the century, it held more than 1,500 patients, of whom roughly 900 were women, and it was administered as a small town in its own right, with its own wards, its own infirmary, and its own staff of attendants. In the early months of 1899, it was also managing an outbreak of typhoid, and its people were stretched thin across the wards. This is the setting into which a parcel would arrive, and it matters, because a death upon such a ward, at such a time, was a death that the ordinary running of the place was not well placed to question. Mary Ann Ansell had been born on the 18th of November in 1877. Her age would later be disputed in the press, some journals giving her as 22 and a minority as 18, and the record does not settle the point cleanly. The birth date, taken plainly, makes her 21 at the time of the crime. She came from a family in which mental illness was documented across more than one of its members, a fact that would carry no weight at all until after her conviction, and would then carry a very great deal. Of her childhood, the record preserves little beyond what her mother would afterwards say of her, and that testimony came only after the conviction, at the point where it was given. By 1899, she was employed as a maidservant in the household of a Mrs. Maloney, at an address in Coram Street, in the Bloomsbury district of London. It was a wealthy household, of the kind that kept living in servants, and her position there was an ordinary one for a young woman of her circumstances. She was engaged to be married. She and the man she was to marry had been obliged to put the wedding off, and the reason they had put it off is the single fact upon which the whole of what followed turns. They could not raise the cost of the marriage licence. The sum required was 7 shillings and 6pence. A shilling, in that currency, was 1/20th of a pound, and 7 shillings. And 6pence was therefore a little over 1/3 of a pound, which for a domestic servant and her intended was real money, and money they did not have. That is the condition in which Mary Ann Ansell was living in the early part of 1899. She was in service, she was engaged, and she was too poor to marry for the want of a sum that a comfortable household would have thought trivial. Everything that the prosecution would later build was built upon the distance between that poverty and the small amount of money that a death might be made to yield. If you value cases preserved through court records, testimony, and verified documents, follow or subscribe wherever you are listening. The record resumes in Hertfordshire in 1899. The woman who died was Caroline Ansell, and she was 19 years old. She was the younger sister of the accused, and she was a patient at Leavesden, resident upon one of its wards, one among the roughly 900 women the institution then held. She came from the same family, with the same documented history of illness within it, and she had been placed in the asylum in the manner that such placements were then made. She was not a symbol of anything, and she was not a lesson. She was a young woman of 19 who lived upon a ward in a large institution, who had companions there, and who, when a parcel arrived for her, did with it the thing that many people would do. She shared it. The parcel reached her upon Ward 7. It had been posted through the ordinary mail, and it contained a cake of the plain domestic kind that a person might bake at home. Caroline Ansell shared the cake with friends upon the ward. Several of those who ate of it became ill. Caroline, who had eaten a good deal more of it than the others, became the most ill of all, and she did not recover. That she shared what she had been sent, and that this act of sharing is the reason more than one person fell sick, is a detail the record has preserved, and it is worth holding on to, because it is the human centre of a case that would afterwards be argued almost entirely in the abstract language of policy and sanity and law. The circumstances that had brought the parcel to Ward 7 had been assembled quietly over the preceding weeks in London. The first of them was a policy of insurance. Mary Ann Ansell had taken out a small policy upon the life of her sister, the premium upon it being 3p a week. The sum it would pay upon a death has been reported in more than one figure. It is given in some accounts as £11 and 5 shillings, and in others as £22, and the record does not agree with itself upon the point, so it is best stated as a policy worth a sum variously reported as £11 5 shillings or £22. Against the 7 shillings and 6p she could not raise for a licence. Either figure was a considerable amount of money. The premium was 3p a week, and 3p a week upon the life of a sister in an asylum was, in the arithmetic of the poor of that period, a small and unremarkable outlay. The second circumstance was the purchase of a poison. In the weeks before the parcel was posted, Mary Ann Ansell bought a quantity of rat poison, of the phosphorus-based kind, then sold openly for the destruction of vermin, from a shop in the vicinity of her employer's house in Bloomsbury. The transaction, at the time it was made, was entirely unremarkable. Such preparations were a common article of trade, bought across counters every day for the ordinary purposes of any household troubled by rats, and the assistant who sold it thought nothing of the sale. It was only afterward, when the assistant was asked to recall it, that the purchase acquired any weight, and the assistant was able to give evidence that the sale had been made. Her account of why she had bought it, given after her arrest, was that there were rats at her employer's house, and that the poison had been meant for them. This explanation collided directly with the testimony of the woman who kept that house. Mrs. Maloney, her mistress, told the police that the house had no trouble with vermin of any kind, and that she had never asked her servant to buy poison, nor authorised any such purchase. The innocent explanation and the mistress's account could not both be true, and the record set them against one another and left them there. The parcel had been prepared in the ordinary way of a kitchen. Mary Ann Ansell mixed the rat poison into a cake batter, baked the cake, and sent it through the post to her sister upon Ward 7 at Leavesden, the parcel being dispatched on the 9th of March in 1899. What was posted was, to any eye that fell upon it in transit, a homemade cake sent from one sister to another, an unremarkable kindness of the kind the mails carried in their thousands every day. It arrived at the asylum. It was delivered to the ward, and it was given to the young woman to whom it was addressed. The illness that followed did not announce itself as anything out of the common run. Several of the patients who had shared the cake fell sick, and in a building already labouring under an outbreak of typhoid, sickness upon a ward was not a thing that seized the immediate attention of an overstretched staff. Caroline Ansell, having eaten the greater share, was the worst affected, and here the conditions of the institution bore directly upon what became of her. The wards were busy, the fever was abroad, and the attendants were spread across a great many patients. It was some time before she was seen by a doctor. When a doctor did attend her, he recognised at once that her condition was grave, and he had her admitted to the infirmary without delay. The admission came too late to alter the outcome. She died in the infirmary. The medical cause of her death was established by post-mortem examination conducted by Dr. Blair, who gave the cause as phosphorus poisoning. Phosphorus was a common active ingredient in the rat pastes and vermin killers sold across the counters of the period, and its presence in the body was consistent with the recovered remains of the cake. That is the whole of what the medical evidence was required to establish, and the whole of what it did establish. There had been no long illness attended by a family physician, no certificate of a natural cause issued and later doubted, no body committed to the ground and afterwards raised. The death had occurred in an infirmary and had been examined promptly once the doctor attended, and the examination named the poison. What the examination could not do of itself was say how the poison had come to the ward. That question was answered not by medicine, but by a scrap of brown paper. The poisoning was traced to the remains of the cake, and the cake was traced by the wrapping in which it had been sent. Upon that wrapping was a postmark, and the postmark was a London postmark. Everything in the case turned upon it. A patient had fallen ill and died upon a crowded ward in the middle of an epidemic, in an institution where such a death might have passed into the register as one more casualty of the fever, and the single thing that turned it into a matter for the police was the mark a post office had stamped upon a piece of paper. Without that mark, there was little in the circumstances to prompt anyone to look further. A young woman resident in an asylum, sick upon a ward where typhoid was already at work, seen late by a doctor because the staff was stretched, admitted to the infirmary and dying there. Every element of that sequence had an innocent reading available to it, and the ordinary running of the institution supplied that reading without any need for suspicion. The postmark broke the sequence. It established that a parcel had come from London, that the cake had been sent and not made on the premises, and it directed attention outward, away from the ward and the fever, toward the person who had posted it. From that single physical link, the whole of the inquiry unfolded. Once the question had been raised, the material that answered it was already in existence and needed only to be gathered. There was the recovered cake and the poison within it. There was the wrapping and its London mark. There was, in a shop in Bloomsbury, an assistant who could recall the sale of a phosphorus rat poison to the young woman in service nearby. There was the small policy of insurance upon the life of the dead girl, taken out by her sister at 3p a week. And there was the household in Coram Street, where the mistress could say that there had been no rats and that she had asked for no poison to be bought. The inquiry did not have to reconstruct a hidden crime from fragments. It had to assemble a set of plain facts that already existed, each one obtainable by asking the right person the right question, and set them beside one another. The suspicion, once it fell upon Mary Ann Ansell, and it was a suspicion built entirely from the convergence of these plain facts. The maidservant in Bloomsbury had insured her sister's life. The maidservant in Bloomsbury had bought a phosphorus poison. A cake laced with phosphorus had been posted from London to that sister upon a ward at Leavesden, and the sister had eaten of it and died. The mistress of the house denied the innocent account of the purchase. There was no single item in that list that convicted, but the list, taken together, pointed in one direction, and it was upon the strength of that convergence that the officers of the law proceeded. The arrest and the charge were made by Superintendent Wood. When the accusation was put to her, Mary Ann Ansell denied it, and she denied it in words that were afterwards set down and repeated. She said, "I know nothing whatever about it. I am as innocent a girl as ever was born." To the matter of the poison, she gave the account already noted, that she had bought it for rats at her employer's house, an account that the testimony of Mrs. Maloney directly contradicted, the mistress maintaining that the house had suffered no vermin and that no such errand had ever been given. From the moment of her arrest to the end, Mary Ann Ansell maintained that she was innocent of the death of her sister. The matter passed from the police into the ordinary course of the law, and the death was investigated and committed for trial. The record of the intermediate proceedings is thin beside the trial and the campaign that followed, and it does not need to be inflated. The case that would be laid before a jury had already taken its shape by this stage, and its shape was simple. It rested upon motive and upon the physical chain that ran from the cake to the postmark to the purchase of the poison. The policy and the poverty supplied the reason. The wrapping and the shop supplied the connection between the accused and the parcel. The post-mortem supplied the cause of death. There was, on the other side, the denial of the accused and her account of the poison, and against that account stood her mistress. Upon this, the case was committed to the Assizes. The trial was held at the Hertford Assizes, sitting at St Albans, and it opened on the 30th of June in 1899. It ran for 2 days. The judge was Mr. Justice Matthew. The charge was wilful murder by poisoning, and to it the prisoner maintained her innocence. She had no substantial defence to offer against the case the prosecution had assembled, and this fact, plain as it is the fact that would be argued over for the rest of her short life, and long after it, because the defence she did not raise was not a defence of fact at all. No question was raised at the trial as to the state of her mind. The prosecution's case was built, as it had been from the committal, almost entirely upon motive and upon the chain that led from the cake to the postmark. The recovered cake and its wrapping were put before the court, the wrapping carrying the London postmark that had begun the whole inquiry. The assistant from the Bloomsbury shop gave evidence of the sale of the phosphorus poison to the prisoner. Mrs. Maloney gave her evidence that her house had no trouble with vermin and that she had never asked her servant to buy poison, and her evidence stood directly against the only innocent explanation the prisoner had offered for the purchase. The small policy of insurance upon the life of the dead girl was placed before the jury as the motive, set against the background of a poverty so straitened that the prisoner and the man she was to marry could not raise 7 shillings and 6pence to be wed. The medical evidence of Dr. Blair established the cause of death as phosphorus poisoning. Each strand was laid down in turn, and together they formed a case to which the defence had little of substance to answer. The most important thing about the trial is a thing that did not happen at it. Insanity was never raised. No medical evidence as to the state of the prisoner's mind was placed before the jury. Nothing was said in that courtroom of the documented history of mental illness within her family, nothing of what her own mother would afterwards say of her, nothing of the doubts that others would afterwards express as to whether she understood what she had done. The jury that tried her heard the case for the prosecution and heard no case at all upon the question of her sanity, because no such case was made. This single omission is the engine of everything that followed the verdict, and the whole of the campaign that would carry her case to the House of Commons was, at bottom, an argument about the trial that had not been held. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty. Despite the youth of the prisoner, they made no recommendation to mercy. Mr. Justice Matthew passed the sentence that the law then required upon a conviction for wilful murder, and the sentence was death. Mary Ann Ansell was returned to the prison at St Albans to await its execution, a prison that had carried out no execution since the year 1880. The verdict had been reached upon the evidence that had been placed before the jury, and upon that evidence it was not a surprising verdict. The chain from the cake to the postmark held. The motive was established, and the innocent account of the poison had been contradicted by the prisoner's own mistress. The jury had before it a coherent case for the prosecution, and no answer to it of any weight, and it convicted in 2 hours. What the jury did not have before it was any material bearing upon whether the young woman in the dock had understood the nature of the act for which she was now to hang, and it was to the supplying of that missing material, too late for the trial, but not, its advocates hoped, too late altogether, that a great many people now turned. The campaign for a reprieve that now gathered around the case was one of the largest of its kind in the late Victorian period, and it assembled itself with unusual speed in the 3 weeks between the sentence and the date fixed for the execution. It did not proceed from any doubt that Mary Ann Ansell had sent the cake. It proceeded from the conviction, held by a widening circle of people, that a woman whose sanity had never been examined ought not to be hanged until it had been, and that the examination the law provided had not been the searching and impartial thing it ought to have been. The campaign was, from first to last, an argument not about guilt, but about fitness, and about the adequacy of the machinery by which the state satisfied itself that a condemned prisoner was fit to die. The first body to move was the one with the closest connection to the dead. The Metropolitan Asylums Board, which administered Leavesden and upon whose ward Caroline Ansell had died, passed a resolution urging clemency for the woman convicted of killing one of its own patients. That the institution which had lost a patient should petition for the life of the patient's killer is a measure of how the case was regarded even by those who had most cause to feel the loss, and it lent the campaign an authority that could not easily be dismissed as sentiment. The press took the case up, and the paper that carried it furthest was the Daily Mail, which campaigned for a reprieve under the headline, "A One-Sided Investigation." Its argument was directed at the conduct of the Home Office. It contended that no serious effort had been made to assess the prisoner's mental state, and it framed her as a poor maidservant who had been failed by society, too poor to marry and never properly examined before she was condemned. The campaign was a newspaper's campaign, conducted with a newspaper's methods, and in a newspaper's interest, in a cause that would sell, and it framed the case to its own ends. But it put before a national readership the charge that the inquiry into the prisoner's sanity had been perfunctory, and that charge was one that others were now prepared to support from nearer the case. Among those who spoke was the prisoner's mother. She told the press that her daughter had been, in her words, silly since the time she was at school, and that she would sometimes talk to herself. It was not the language of a medical man, and it was not offered as a diagnosis. It was the account of a mother, describing in plain words a daughter she had watched grow, and it was placed into the public argument as evidence of a mind that had never been ordinary and had never been examined. The prison chaplain spoke also, though with the caution proper to his position. He indicated that he had found the case a difficult one upon which to reach a settled view, and he expressed his own doubt as to whether the condemned woman understood the gravity of the crime for which she was to die. Here was a man who saw the prisoner in the condemned cell, in the ordinary discharge of his office, and who came away uncertain whether she grasped what had been done and what was to be done to her. His doubt was not proof of anything, and he did not offer it as proof. It was one more voice, and a voice placed close to her in her last days, added to those saying that the question of her mind had not been answered. Then the foreman of the jury that had convicted her spoke, and of all the interventions this was the one that struck deepest because it came from within the verdict itself. Charles Cusworth of Warwick House, Capel Road, in New Bushey, had been the foreman of the jury at St Albans. He now stated publicly that had the evidence since published regarding the prisoner's insanity been placed before the jury at the trial, the jury, in his opinion, would have been unanimous in recommending that the sentence be commuted. This was not a bystander's plea for mercy. It was the foreman of the convicting jury declaring that the 12 men who had found her guilty had done so without material, that had they seen it, would have moved every one of them to ask that her life be spared. The verdict stood, but the man who had delivered it had now said, in public, that it had been reached in ignorance of something that mattered. The campaign carried the case into Parliament, and there it was raised not once but upon 3 separate sitting days, in July of 1899, on the 13th, the 17th and the 18th. On each occasion the case of Mary Ansell was put to the government, and on each occasion the pressure was for the same thing, a postponement of the execution long enough to allow the state of her mind to be properly and independently determined. The matter reached its sharpest point on the 18th of July in an exchange recorded in the parliamentary reports of that day, when Mr. Dalziel rose to put the case directly to the Home Secretary. Dalziel put before the House the statement of the jury foreman. He laid it out plainly that the foreman of the very jury that had convicted the prisoner had declared that the jury would have been unanimous in recommending commutation had the evidence of her insanity been before them, and upon the strength of that statement he asked the Home Secretary to grant a postponement of the execution pending an independent inquiry into her sanity. The word he used was independent, and it was that word that drew the sharpest part of the reply. The Home Secretary was Sir Matthew White Ridley, and he refused. He told the House that, after full inquiry and after consultation with the judge who had tried the case, he was satisfied that had the question of insanity been raised at the trial, there was no evidence to that effect which could properly have affected the verdict. He objected, and objected pointedly, to the word independent, taking it as an insinuation against the department over which he presided and against the impartiality of the inquiry it had already made. When Dalziel pressed him further, raising the doubts that the prison chaplain had expressed, Ridley answered only that every point in the case had been fully within his knowledge for the past week, and had received his best consideration. He would not grant the postponement. He would not concede that the inquiry already made had been anything less than sufficient, and he would not accept the suggestion carried in the word independent that a further and more impartial examination was required. The inquiry to which Ridley referred had in fact been made, and its terms were set out in a letter from the Home Office dated the 15th of July, addressed to a Mr. Jobson, who had organised the public petition for a reprieve. The letter stated that the Secretary of State, having caused a special medical inquiry into the convict's mental condition to be made by Dr. D. Nicholson, a visitor in lunacy, and Dr. R. Brain, the superintendent of Broadmoor Asylum, under Section 2 of the Criminal Lunatics Act of 1884, had been unable to find sufficient grounds to advise Her Majesty to interfere with the course of the law. The terms visitor in Lunacy and Criminal Lunatics Act were the legal and institutional language of the period, and they described the formal machinery by which the state examined the sanity of the condemned. 2 doctors of standing had examined her under that machinery. Under the rules by which the courts of the time determined the question, the rules known as the Monacton Rules, she was found to be sane, and the general position Ridley maintained was that in cases of deliberate poisoning, the law must take its course. That was the answer the campaign received, and it was a complete answer in the terms in which the state framed the question. 2 medical men had examined the prisoner under the relevant statute. They had not found grounds to certify her insane. Under the legal test, she was sane, and the Home Secretary would not interfere. Against this stood the mother, who had known her since childhood, the chaplain who attended her in the cell, the foreman of the jury that had convicted her, 100 members of Parliament who signed a petition on the day before she was due to die, asking for a week's postponement while her mind was determined, and the board that had run the asylum where her sister died. On one side was the formal finding of the law, on the other was the accumulated doubt of a great many people who had looked at the same young woman and were not satisfied. The law did not resolve the doubt, it declined to be moved by it. The execution was carried out on the morning of Wednesday, the 19th of July, in 1899, within the walls of St Albans prison at 8 o'clock. The executioner was James Billington, and on this occasion he worked without an assistant. The press was excluded from the prison, in keeping with the law that had governed executions since they were removed from public view in 1868, and for that reason no direct account of what took place inside the walls exists. What is known of the prisoner's last morning comes from a single source, given afterward at second hand, and it is given here once and plainly. Outside the prison, at the main gate, a crowd of roughly 2,000 people gathered to wait upon the hour. They had come not to see the execution, which no member of the public could now witness, but to see the signs by which its completion was announced to those without, the raising of the black flag above the walls and the posting of the notice at the gate. It was reported that some among the crowd knelt in prayer as 8 o'clock came. That so large a number should assemble at the gate of a country prison for a death they could not see is itself a measure of the hold the case had taken upon the public in the weeks of the campaign. The account of the prisoner's last walk was given afterward to a reporter by the chief warder, Edward Lloyd. He said that she had faltered a little as she was taken to the scaffold between two warders, that she was sobbing and praying throughout, and that she was heard to say the words, "O my God in heaven, and Lord have mercy upon my soul." That is the whole of the account, and it is the only narrative that exists of her final minutes. It is set down here as Lloyd gave it, and it is not enlarged upon. The manner of the death itself, its mechanics and its particulars form no part of this record and are left where the law of the time left them, out of sight and unreported. The execution placed Mary Ann Ansell into the record of British capital punishment in more than one respect. She was the youngest woman to be hanged in private in Britain. She was the last woman to be hanged in the 19th century, the century closing without another. And she took her place in a small and particular company, for of the 23 women executed in private in Britain between 1868, when public executions ended, and the close of the century in 1899, 12, just over half, had been convicted of poisoning. Poison was the method that brought women to the private scaffold more often than any other in those years, and her case was among the last of them, and the last of all in that century. Her body was buried within the prison, as the law then required of those executed, and it remained there for more than 3 decades. In 1931, her remains were removed and reinterred in the St Albans city cemetery, taken out of the prison ground in which the condemned were laid, and given a place in the public burial ground of the city. It is a small administrative act, recorded without ceremony, and it is the last dated entry in the sequence of her story, coming 32 years after the morning at the gate. The case, once it had closed, took its place in the particular economy of circumstance that had produced it, and that economy is worth setting out, because it is the social engine of the whole affair. At the base of it lay a form of insurance that was widely available to the poor of the period, the small policy upon a life, carried for a premium of a few pence a week. Such policies were sold in their multitudes to working people, and they served, for many families, the entirely honest purpose of meeting the cost of a burial that would otherwise have fallen upon people who could not bear it. But the same instrument that met an honest need also created a perverse incentive, for it placed upon a life a cash value that was to the very poor not negligible. A 3-penny premium upon the life of a sister could return a sum that a domestic servant could not otherwise have assembled in a year of saving, and it was this arithmetic, the small weekly outlay set against the lump sum a death would yield, that the prosecution had placed before the jury as the motive. Against the 7 shillings and 6pence that could not be found for a marriage licence, the payout upon the policy, whatever its exact figure, was transformation. The second element of the case's circumstance was the vulnerability of the institutionalised. Caroline Ansell was a patient in a very large asylum, one of more than 1,500 people held in a single establishment, and the conditions of such a place bore directly upon how her death was first received. In an institution of that size, administering that number of dependent people, and doing so in the middle of a typhoid outbreak with a staff stretched across the wards, the death of a single patient did not arrest attention as the death of a person in an ordinary household might. The machinery of the place was built to manage numbers, and a death within it, absent some external prompt tended to be absorbed into the register as one more of the many the institution recorded. It was precisely this quality, the tendency of such a death to pass without particular scrutiny, that the postmark disturbed, and it was precisely this quality, the record would later establish, that had recommended the asylum as the place for the crime. The third element was the manner in which the late Victorian public and its newspapers received the figure of a woman accused of murder, and in particular a woman accused of poisoning. The poisoning of a relative by a woman was a category of crime that the press of the period treated with a fixed and heightened attention, and around any such case there formed a familiar apparatus of comment, of moral argument, of appeals for severity and appeals for mercy. The campaign for Mary Ann Ansell drew upon the mercy side of that apparatus, and the Daily Mail's framing of her as a poor servant failed by society was one of the recognised forms that such comment took. The case became, for a period of weeks, a public occasion of the kind these cases regularly became, argued in the papers and in the correspondence columns, and in this instance upon the floor of the Commons before it closed and passed out of the daily notice of the country. What the case left behind it in the longer record was not chiefly the crime, which was in its particulars a small and squalid one, a policy of a few pounds and a cake sent through the post, but the argument that had surrounded its close. It became a landmark in the debate over how the sanity of a condemned prisoner was to be assessed, and over the adequacy and the independence of the medical inquiry that the Home Office conducted under the Criminal Lunatics Act. The intervention in Parliament across 3 sitting days, the petition of 100 members, the public recantation of the jury foreman, and the resolution of the very board that had run the asylum, together constituted a challenge, not to the finding of guilt, but to the process by which the state had satisfied itself that the guilty woman was fit to hang. The Home Secretary had answered that challenge by asserting the sufficiency of the inquiry he had already made, and by refusing the further and independent examination the campaign demanded, and the execution had proceeded upon that answer. The question the campaign had raised, whether the machinery for determining a condemned prisoner's sanity was searching enough and impartial enough to bear the weight the law placed upon it, was not settled by the case. It was raised by it, in the most public way the Constitution allowed, and it was left open. There remained at the centre of the whole matter a single unresolved question of fact that the record has never closed, and it is not the question of whether Mary Ann Ansell sent the cake. That question the record does close. What it does not close is the question of her mind, and upon that question the record preserves 2 sets of testimony that do not agree and were never reconciled. On the one side stand the mother who had known her from childhood and called her silly since her school days, the chaplain who attended her in the condemned cell and doubted that she understood the gravity of her crime, and the foreman of the jury who had convicted her and afterward declared that the jury would not have let her hang had they known what he had since come to know. On the other side stand 2 medical men, Dr. Nicholson and Dr. Brain, who examined her under the statute and did not find her insane within the meaning of the law, and the Home Secretary who accepted their finding and would not be moved from it. The one set of voices spoke from long acquaintance and close attendance and the instinct of ordinary observation. The other spoke from formal examination under the legal test. The law preferred the second and acted upon it, and the young woman was hanged. Whether the law was right to prefer it is the question the case leaves, and it is a question the record states and does not answer. It is in the light of that unresolved question that the last piece of the documentary record falls, and it is the piece that was longest in coming, for it did not become public until the year 2000, more than a century after the execution, when a Home Office file relating to the case was released. That file records her admission that she had sent the poisoned cake. It closes for good any lingering doubt as to the fact of the crime, for it preserves in the official record the prisoner's own acknowledgement of the act. but the same file carries with it the detail that gives the crime its particular and lasting shape. The reason, as the record has it, that she chose her sister and chose the asylum. She had believed that a death in an asylum would not be investigated. That belief was not an idle one, and the circumstances of the death had come very close to confirming it. Everything about the place and the moment had tended toward exactly the outcome she was said to have counted upon. The asylum held more than 1,500 people. It was in the grip of a typhoid outbreak. Its wards were short of hands, and a patient who fell ill upon one of them was seen late, because the staff who might have seen her sooner were spread across too many beds. When Caroline Ansell sickened, her illness read at first as the fever that was already abroad in the building, and there was nothing in the ordinary running of the institution to make anyone read it otherwise. Had the cake been baked upon the premises, or had it come without a wrapping, or had the wrapping been discarded before anyone thought to look at it, the death would in all likelihood have entered the register as one more casualty of the epidemic, and no inquiry would ever have been made. The calculation, if it was a calculation, was sound in every particular but one. It had not allowed for the postmark. That single oversight is the whole distance between a death that would have gone unexamined and a case that reached the House of Commons. A person who intends that a death shall not be investigated must arrange that nothing about it invites investigation, and in almost every respect the arrangement had held. The victim was where deaths were common and inquiry was rare. The timing placed the death within an outbreak that furnished a ready and innocent explanation. The method left a cause that could be mistaken upon a busy ward for the prevailing sickness. What defeated the arrangement was not the vigilance of the institution, which the record shows to have been overwhelmed, and not the suspicion of any person upon the ward, for none is recorded to have arisen unprompted. What defeated it was a piece of paper that a post office in London had stamped in the course of its ordinary business, and that survived long enough to be looked at. The inquiry that followed did not begin with a suspicion of murder and work toward the proof. It began with the postmark and worked outward from it, and only then did the murder appear. The case drew contemporary comment beyond the daily press, and it was noticed in the weekly journals that took a broader view of the events of the day. The Spectator remarked upon it in its issue of the 22nd of July in 1899, in the days immediately after the execution, describing the condemned woman as a domestic servant of 22 and treating the case as an occasion for reflection upon the questions it had raised. Beyond such contemporary notice, the case did not pass into the wider culture in the manner that a handful of Victorian poisoning trials did. It attracted no major dramatisation and no enduring popular retelling. It survived rather in the specialised record, in the histories of capital punishment that catalogue the executions of the period, and in the local history of St Albans and of Hertfordshire, where the events had taken place and where the prison stood. It is remembered, where it is remembered at all, less as a crime than as a case that tested the machinery of the law at the point where that machinery decided who was fit to die. In that specialised record, its place is fixed by a small number of firsts and lasts, and they are worth stating together, as the record states them, for they are the reason the case is preserved at all. Here was the last woman hanged in Britain in the 19th century, the century turning over, without another woman brought to the scaffold. Here was the youngest woman hanged in private in the whole span of private executions to that date. And here was a case in which the assessment of a condemned prisoner's sanity and the independence and sufficiency of the inquiry the Home Office made into it under the Criminal Lunatics Act of 1884 were tested in public and found by a great many contemporaries to be wanting, though the state that conducted the inquiry defended it as adequate and acted upon its result. The institutional weight of the case lies there, in the challenge it put to the process, and not in the crime, which was among the smallest in its material particulars that ever brought a person to the gallows. For the sum in question was, by any reckoning, very small. A policy worth at the most £22 and, by the lower account, £11 and 5 shillings, carried for a premium of 3p in the week, set against the life of a sister of 19 and the life of the woman who sent the cake, and set against, at the root of it, the 7 shillings and 6p that 2 poor people could not raise in order to be married. The arithmetic of the case is the arithmetic of extreme poverty, in which sums that a comfortable household would not have paused over stood between a young woman and the ordinary course of her life, and in which the cash value that a cheap insurance policy placed upon a relative's death was, to a person with nothing, a real and tempting figure. It was upon that arithmetic that the prosecution had rested its account of the motive, and it was that arithmetic, more than any cruelty or design the record attributes to her, that the case set on display. What the campaign had asked in the end was not that any of this be undone, for the campaign did not dispute that she had sent the cake, and the file released in 2000 has since confirmed that she sent it. What the campaign had asked was that the state pause long enough. A week was the term the 100 members proposed, to be sure that the woman it was about to hang had understood, in the full and legal sense the law required, the nature and the wrongfulness of what she had done. The mother said she'd been simple since her school days. The chaplain said he doubted she understood the gravity of her crime. The foreman of the convicting jury said the jury would not have let her hang had they known what he had learned. 2 doctors appointed under the statute said she was sane within the meaning of the Emnachten rules, and the Home Secretary, satisfied with their finding and offended by the suggestion that a more independent inquiry was needed, refused the week. She was hanged upon that refusal on the morning of the 19th of July before a crowd of 2,000 who could see nothing but a flag. The legal test upon which her fate had turned was itself a thing of the century then closing, and it is worth stating in the terms the law used, for it is the standard against which every one of the doubts raised on her behalf had to be measured. The rules by which the courts determined the sanity of an accused had been settled in 1843 in the aftermath of another case, and they turned upon a narrow question. They asked whether, at the time of the act, the accused had laboured under such a defect of reason, from disease of the mind, as not to know the nature and quality of the act being done, or, if that was known, not to know that the act was wrong. It was a test of knowledge, and of a particular and limited kind of knowledge, and it was not a test of whether a person was simple, or strange, or given to talking to herself, or slow to grasp the weight of things. A person might be all of those and still, under the rule, know that a cake laced with poison would kill, and that to kill was wrong, and if she knew those things the rule counted her sane, whatever else might be said of her mind. It was against that test that the 2 doctors appointed under the Criminal Lunatics Act had examined Mary Ann Ansell, and it was in the terms of that test that they had returned their finding. The mother's account of a daughter who had been simple since her school days did not meet it. The chaplain's doubt as to whether she understood the gravity of her crime came nearer to it. For gravity is close to wrongfulness, but a doubt expressed by a clergyman untrained in the matter was not evidence upon which the finding could be disturbed. The foreman's statement went to what the jury would have done, not to what the medical men were bound to determine, and the jury's compassion, however unanimous it might have been, was not the measure the statute set. The measure the statute set was the Emnachten test, applied by 2 examiners, and by that measure she was found sane. The gap between what the ordinary people around her saw and what the legal test permitted the examiners to certify is the gap into which her case fell, and it is the gap that her advocates were trying, in those 3 weeks of July, to force the state to look into once more before it was too late to matter. They did not succeed in forcing it. The state looked once by its own machinery, reached its finding, and declined to look again. The distance between the finding of the law and the doubt of those who had known her was never closed, and it was carried unclosed to the scaffold and past it into the file that would not be opened for 100 years. For 100 years, the acknowledgement she's recorded to have made lay where the state had placed it, in a Home Office file closed to the public, while the argument about her mind went on being argued in the only materials that were open. Those who wrote of the case in the decades between the execution and the release of that file wrote without the one document that spoke in her own account of the act. They had the Hansard record of the 3 sitting days in July, the reports of the campaign, the resolution of the Asylum Board, the foreman's public statement, the letters, and the newspaper columns. They did not have the file, and so for the whole of the 20th century, the case could be told only as it had stood on the morning at the gate, as a conviction upon circumstantial evidence, contested to the last by a widening body of doubt about whether the woman convicted had understood what she had done. The fact of guilt, which the file would in the end settle, remained through all those years technically an inference, strong and unbroken, but never confirmed from the source that mattered most. When the file was at last opened, it changed one thing and left the other exactly as it had been. It removed the question of whether she had sent the cake, for it held her own admission that she had. It did not remove, and could not remove, the question that the mother and the chaplain and the foreman had raised, because that question was never about the act. It was about the mind behind the act, and about whether the machinery the state used to examine such a mind had been equal to the weight it was made to carry. The admission preserved in the file spoke to what she had done. It did not speak to whether she should have understood in the full sense the law demanded that she was doing it, and the 2 doctors who had been sent to determine precisely that had left behind only their finding, not the reasoning by which they reached it. The gap that her advocates had named in July of 1899 between the observation of those who knew her and the certification of those who examined her was not narrowed by the opening of the file. If anything, it was set in sharper relief, for now the certainty of the deed stood beside the same unresolved uncertainty about the doer that had troubled the case from the day the sentence was passed. That is the shape in which the record leaves her. A young woman in service too poor to marry for the want of £1/3, who insured a sister's life for 3p a week and posted a poisoned cake to a ward in an asylum in the belief that a death there would not be looked into, who was undone by a postmark, tried in 2 days, convicted in 2 hours, and refused the week's reprieve that 100 members of Parliament had asked for, and about whom the people closest to her, her mother, her chaplain, and the foreman of the jury that condemned her, all said, in one form or another, that she had not understood what she had done, while the doctors of the state said that in the eye of the law she had. The record holds both of those things and reconciles neither. It sets the admission beside the doubt and closes over both, and it hands to anyone who reads it now the same question it handed to the House of Commons in the last summer of the century. It is a question that outlived the particular machinery that produced it. The statute under which the 2 doctors examined her, and the office of the visitor in lunacy that one of them held, belonged to a system of law and of institutions that the coming century would remake, and the very terms in which the inquiry had been framed, the language of lunacy and of the criminal lunatic, would in time fall out of the law altogether. But the difficulty the case exposed did not fall out with the words. The difficulty was structural, and it lay in the point at which a single Department of State, having secured a conviction, was also the body that decided whether the convicted person was fit to suffer the sentence. It was that concentration, the Home Office inquiring into a matter upon which the Home Office had already, in effect, taken a position, that the word independent had been aimed at, and that the Home Secretary had rejected as an insinuation rather than answered as a criticism. The campaign had put its finger on the joint in the machinery, the place where the interests of prosecution and the duty of impartial examination met in the same hands, and the answer it received was that the hands were to be trusted. Whether they were is the matter the case left for the record to weigh, and the weighing has never produced a settled verdict. Around that unsettled centre, the plain facts sit as they always have, neither adding to the doubt nor subtracting from it, but giving it its human measure. A sister of 19 who shared a cake with her friends upon a ward. A maidservant of 1 or 2 and 20 who could not raise the price of a wedding. A premium of 3p a week and a payout of a few pounds. A shop assistant who remembered a sale he had thought nothing of. A mistress who said there were no rats. A postmark from London upon a scrap of brown paper. A jury of 2 hours. A foreman who could not afterward rest with what the jury had done. 100 names on a petition delivered the day before the drop, and a Home Secretary who read them all and moved for none of them. These are the fixed points of the case, and they do not change with the opening of any file or the passage of any number of years. What changes from one reading to the next is only the weight a reader gives to the doubt they surround, and that weight the record declines to assign. And so the case comes down, in the end, to a matter of what a record can and cannot do. It can preserve a date, a sum, a name, a form of words spoken in a cell or across the floor of the Commons. It can hold the admission and the doubt side by side and keep them both from being lost. What it cannot do is choose between them. And in this case, it was never asked to, for the question the campaign raised was not one that the gathering of more facts could answer. More facts were gathered. The file was in time released and the admission read. The 3 days of debate were printed and preserved. The foreman's words, the mother's words, the chaplain's words were all set down and have all survived. And still the thing they were arguing about, whether the woman who did what she admitted doing had understood it as the law required her to understand it, stands exactly where it stood on the 18th of July, when a member rose in the House and asked for a week, and the Home Secretary, who had considered every point within his knowledge, said no. The record carried the question forward from that afternoon, through the morning at the gate, through the removal of the remains 3 decades on, through the 100 years the file lay closed, and it carries it still, unanswered, because it was, in the terms the law had set for itself, unanswerable. The whole of it rests upon the distance between 2 facts that the record states with equal certainty and refuses to bring together. She admitted that she sent the cake, and the man who had led the jury that convicted her said, in public and without being asked, that had that jury known what he had since learned, it would not have let her die. Between the guilt she acknowledged and the mercy the foreman believed she was owed lies everything the case was ever about, and the record sets down both and joins neither. That refusal to join them is not a failure of the record, but the honest condition of it. To join them would be to decide the case, and the case was not decided in its own time. Not by the trial that never heard the question, not by the inquiry that answered it in the narrow terms of the statute, not by the Parliament that debated it across 3 afternoons, and not by the century of silence that followed while the file lay shut. Each of those had its chance to close the matter, and each closed only a part of it. The trial closed the question of the evidence. The inquiry closed the question of the legal test. The execution closed the question of the sentence. What none of them closed was the question underneath all 3. The question of whether a young woman of 1 or 2 and 20, called simple by her mother since her school days, doubted by the chaplain who sat with her at the last, and mourned in advance by the foreman who had helped condemn her, had possessed, on the day she mixed the poison into the batter, the understanding that the law required before it took her life. That question was raised at the very edge of the time in which anything could be done about it, and it was refused at that same edge, and it has been ours to hold unresolved ever since. She sent the cake. She said so, in the end, in words the state kept for 100 years, and the foreman of the jury that sent her to the scaffold did not believe she should have hanged for it. The record leaves those 2 facts standing, a few inches apart, and it does not reach across the gap between them. It is worth staying for a moment with what that gap actually held, because it was not an abstraction to the people standing at its edges. To the mother, it was a daughter she had watched from childhood, who talked to herself and had never, in her account, been quite as other children were, and whom she now watched pass beyond any help she could give. To the chaplain, it was a prisoner in a cell whom he was charged to prepare for death, and who left him, after all his sitting with her, unsure that she grasped why the death was coming. To the foreman, it was a verdict he had spoken aloud in a courtroom, and could not afterward lay down, a thing he had done in good faith upon what he was shown, and which he came to believe he would not have done had he been shown more. 3 people, each looking at the same young woman from a different distance, and each arriving at the same unease, and against the 3 of them, the finding of 2 doctors who had seen her briefly, and under a test that asked only whether she knew a poisoned cake would kill, and knew that killing was wrong. The law took the 2, and the 2 were enough, and the drop fell on the strength of them. Everything the case became after that morning, the debates already printed, the file already sealed, the remains already laid in the prison ground to wait there 3 decades before removal, followed from the sufficiency the state claimed for that finding, and the campaign denied it. There is nothing further the record adds, and nothing it takes away. It sets down the poverty, the policy, the poison, the parcel, the postmark, the trial, the campaign, the commons, the refusal, the crowd, the flag, and the long-kept admission, and it holds them in the order in which they happened, and it stops. What remains, after all of it, is the smallness of the thing set against the size of what it raised. A cake through the post, a few pounds of insurance, a licence that could not be paid for. It is easy, at the distance of more than a century, to feel the whole affair shrink to those household figures, to a domestic quarrel with poverty in which one life was spent to release a sum that would barely have kept a family a season. But the case did not stay that small, and the reason it did not is that the state, in taking the one life for the other, was made to show its working, and the working would not satisfy the people who watched it done. That is the whole of why the name survives at all. Not for the deed, which was mean and quickly told, but for the 3 weeks in which a country argued, in its newspapers and its cell corridors and its parliament, about whether it understood the mind of the person it was about to kill, and decided, on a narrow test and a divided conscience, that it did. She was hanged on a summer morning at a country prison, before a crowd that could see only a wall, a flag, and a notice pinned to a gate. The century she closed had begun its executions in the open, before whatever crowd chose to come, and ended them behind stone, reported at second hand by a single warder. Her death sat at that boundary, the last of the women of the century, the youngest to die out of public sight, and it carried into the hidden manner of the new age, the oldest of the questions. The old one had never answered, which was not whether she had done it, but whether she should have died for it. Consider only the interval the case occupied. 3 weeks stood between the passing of the sentence at the end of June and the drop on the 19th of July. Into those weeks was pressed the whole of the effort to save her. The resolution of the Asylum Board, the columns of the newspaper, the words of the mother and the chaplain, the public statement of the foreman, the special medical inquiry ordered and completed, the letter to the organiser of the petition, the 100 signatures gathered, and the 3 separate risings in the House of Commons. It was a great deal of machinery to set in motion in so short a time, and all of it turned upon a single lever, the granting of 1 further week, which was the modest thing the petitioners asked for, and the exact thing they were denied. They did not at the last ask for her life outright. They asked only for time, for a pause of 7 days in which the one question the trial had never put could be put properly, and answered by examiners the campaign would accept as impartial. The refusal of that week is the hinge upon which the human part of the story finally rests, for it meant that the doubt, whatever its true weight, was never given the interval in which it might have been resolved one way or the other. It was overtaken by the clock, and the clock on the morning of the 19th, ran out. There is a particular kind of finality in that. A verdict can be appealed, a sentence commuted, a file reopened after 100 years and read afresh. But the week that was asked for and refused cannot be returned. And the examination that a longer pause might have allowed cannot now be made, for the person it would have examined was taken beyond examination on the morning it was refused. Whatever the two doctors saw, or failed to see, in the brief time the statute allowed them, is all that will ever be known of her mind under the test the law required. And it was upon that brief seeing, and the Home Secretary's confidence in it, that everything after it turned. What the state left behind of that seeing was a conclusion without its reasons. The letter of the 15th of July records that the inquiry was made and records its result, that no sufficient grounds were found to advise interference with the course of the law, but it does not set out what the two examiners observed, what questions they asked, or how they weighed what the mother and the chaplain had by then already said in public. The finding is preserved as a finding and no more. It is stated in the flat administrative language of a department satisfied that it has discharged its duty, and it is that flatness, as much as the outcome, that the campaign found intolerable, for it seemed to them that a matter of life carried in it, and answered in the same breath as a routine denial, ought to have shown more of its working than a single sentence in a letter to the man who had gathered the names. The Home Secretary's position was that the working had been done, thoroughly and within his knowledge, and that it did not require to be displayed to satisfy an insinuation. The campaign's position was that a conclusion no one could inspect was a conclusion no one need trust. Between those two views the case was decided, and it was decided for the first. That, in the end, is the durable thing the case put on record. Not a crime, which was slight, and not a doubt about guilt, which the years dissolved, but a lasting example of the difficulty of trusting a single office to examine itself, and of what it costs when the request to have that examination checked by other hands is met not with the check but with offence at the asking, the maidservant too poor to marry, the sister on the ward, the cake, the postmark, the 2 hours of the jury, and the 2 doctors of the state, all of it gathered around that difficulty and gave it a name and a date, and the name and the date are why the case is still opened at all. The paper survives where the people do not. The columns of the parliamentary report for the 18th of July hold the exchange as it was spoken, the question put and the answer given, the objection to a single word and the refusal that followed it, and they can be read now exactly as they were set in type in the last summer of the century. The letter of the 15th survives, with its 2 doctors named and its statute cited. The comment of the weekly journal survives, describing a servant girl and turning her death to reflection. Even the removal of the remains 3 decades on left its small dry entry. All of it is there, legible, dated, fixed. The only thing not there, the only thing no quantity of preserved paper supplies, is the answer to the question all that paper was generated to argue. And the reader who assembles the documents today ends where the House of Commons ended, holding a complete account of what was done and an empty space where the justification for the certainty ought to sit. It is an uncomfortable inheritance, and it was meant by the people who fought the case to be uncomfortable. They did not win the weak. They did not save the woman. What they did was ensure that the doubt was entered into the permanent record of the nation, spoken on its floor and printed in its journals, so that the execution could never afterward be read as a thing done cleanly and without objection. They lost, and in losing they made the loss a matter of record, and the record has kept their objection alive long after the office that overruled it, and the statute it invoked, and the very words it used for the mind it was examining have all passed out of the law. For all the noise of those 3 weeks, the quiet that followed was almost complete. A case that had filled newspaper columns and reached the floor of the Commons 3 times over slipped, within a season of the execution, out of the daily attention of the country and did not return to it. There was no dramatisation to carry the name forward, no ballad, no long-running controversy of the kind that kept a few other poisoning cases of the century in circulation for generations. The woman who had briefly been the subject of 100 signatures and a national newspaper's campaign passed into the narrow keeping of the specialists, the catalogues of executions and the parish and county histories, and there she stayed. The very completeness of the state's answer, its refusal to concede that any question remained open, may have helped that quiet along, for a matter officially settled invites less retelling than a matter left visibly raw, and yet the rawness was there all along, folded into the sealed file and the printed debates, waiting for anyone who cared to lay the documents side by side to see that the settling had settled only the part that was never truly in dispute. When the file did open at the turn of the next century, but one, it drew a brief renewal of notice, the interest that attends any long-closed record suddenly made public, and then that too subsided. The admission it held was reported, the belief attributed to her about the safety of an asylum death was noted, and the case returned to its shelf. It had been for a few weeks in 1899 one of the most argued over matters in the country, and it became again what it has largely remained, a small entry in the history of how Britain hanged its condemned, and of how, at the very end of the century, it satisfied itself that the condemned were fit to hang. It is left, then, to the plain sequence to carry what meaning the case still holds, and the plain sequence is soon told over. A young woman worked in a Bloomsbury house for a mistress who found her ordinary enough until the day the police came asking about poison. A younger sister lived on a ward among 900 women and shared what was sent to her, as she had no reason not to. A few pence a week bought a claim on that sister's life, and a few pence more bought the means to collect it, and the whole of it travelled north in a parcel that any sorter might have handled, and none thought twice about. The distance from that parcel to a scaffold was covered in a little over 4 months, from the posting on the 9th of March to the drop on the 19th of July, and within those 4 months lay a death, a burial, a suspicion, an arrest, a committal, a trial, a conviction, a campaign, a debate in Parliament, a medical enquiry, a refusal, and an execution. It is a very great deal to have been set in motion by a homemade cake, and it is the compression of it, as much as anything, that gives the case its strange gravity, the sense of an enormous apparatus of law and state and public feeling brought to bear at speed upon a matter that began in a kitchen and a want of a few shillings. And at the centre of that apparatus, moved by it and unable to move it, was the woman herself, who said from her arrest that she knew nothing of it and was as innocent a girl as ever was born, who was heard at the last to call upon God in heaven and to ask for mercy on her soul, and who, in a file kept shut for 100 years, is recorded to have owned the deed after all. The record holds her denial and her admission, both, the one spoken to a police superintendent in the spring and the other preserved by the state across a century, and it does not tell us how to hold them together, any more than it tells us how to weigh the doubt about her mind against the finding of the 2 men sent to settle it. The 2 utterances were made to different listeners, and for different reasons, and that alone accounts for much of the distance between them without resolving anything behind it. The denial was spoken in the open, to the officer who charged her and, through him, to the world that would try her. It was the thing a person in her position would say whether guilty or not, and it was said again and again through the months that followed, held to as a public posture long after the evidence had made it untenable in a courtroom. The admission was another kind of speech entirely, made not for any audience she could see, entered into the closed record of a department, and not meant to be read by the living public at all. And it was that privacy, in the end, that made it worth the keeping, and worth the weight the record now gives it. A denial maintained before a jury proves little, people maintain their innocence for every reason under the sun. An admission made where no crowd could hear it and sealed away for 100 years is a different order of thing, and it is why the question of guilt, whatever survived of it into the 20th century, does not survive into ours. But an admission of the deed is not an account of the mind, and here the record's two voices fall silent together, for she left no explanation of herself that reaches us, no statement of what she had understood or failed to understand when she stood at the stove with the poison in her hand. What we have of her mind is all second-hand, the mother's word, the chaplain's doubt, the foreman's regret, the doctor's finding, each of them speaking about her, and none of them her own. The one person who could have closed the question the whole case turned upon was the one person the case never let speak to it. And then the morning came, and the flag went up, and the notice was fixed to the gate, and the chance to ask was gone. That silence, her own, is the deepest of the several the case contains, and it is the one no release of papers can ever fill. The file that opened at the turn of the century gave back the fact of the deed, but not the person who did it. It confirmed an act and left a stranger. Everything that might have told us who she was in her own understanding, whether she followed the argument being made on her behalf, whether she grasped that 100 men in Parliament had set their names to a paper asking for her, whether she knew in the cell what the week she was denied would have been for, all of that went with her and was not written down. The chaplain, who might have known best, said only that he doubted she understood, and left it there. And so the record, for all its dates and sums and printed exchanges, closes upon an absence at the very middle of itself, the absence of the one voice that could have spoken to what it was all about, and it is around that absence that everything else the case preserved arranges itself. We are left to read the outside of her then, the parts that others recorded, and to set them in their order, and to resist the pull to fill the gap in the middle with a certainty the record withholds. She was young, she was poor, she ensured a life and ended it. She was tried and convicted on evidence that held. She was doubted by those near her and found sane by those sent to judge her. She was refused a week and hanged on a summer morning, the last of the century's women to die that way. And 100 years later, a file confirmed what the evidence had always said and told us nothing we did not know about the only thing still worth asking. There is a discipline the case seems to demand of anyone who takes it up, and it is the discipline of not deciding. The temptation runs both ways. It is easy to make of her a victim of a cruel and careless state, a simple girl ground up by a machine too proud to pause, and it is just as easy to make of her the opposite, a woman who planned a killing for money and hid behind a plea of a weak mind when the rope drew near. The record supports neither portrait cleanly, and it punishes both, for against the first stands the deliberateness of the purchase and the posting and the small cold sum insured, and against the second stand the mother, the chaplain, and above all the foreman, none of whom had any interest in softening her guilt, and all of whom came away troubled. To hold to what the record actually contains is to hold both of those pressures at once and to let neither win, which is an uncomfortable place to stand and the only honest one. That is finally why the case is worth the telling, more than a century on. Not because it is lurid, for it is not. The crime was drab, and the method quiet, and the whole of it turned on Shillings. It is worth the telling because it is a clean instance of a hard thing, of a state doing the most serious act it can do to a person, while a great many reasonable people begged it, in the plainest terms, and through every channel open to them, to be sure first that it had the right to. The state said it was sure. The people who asked were not. And the record, keeping faith with both, sets down the surety and the doubt in the same pages, and leaves the reader to carry them out of the archive together, exactly as they were carried into it. What is carried out of that archive is, in the end, only paper, and it is worth remembering how little of it there is against the size of what it decided. A few columns of a parliamentary report, a single letter with 2 doctors named in it, a newspaper's headline and the paragraphs beneath it, a weekly journal's short notice, the bare entries of a conviction, a sentence, an execution, and 3 decades later, a removal of remains. A file thin enough to lie shut for 100 years without anyone missing it, holding a few sentences of admission. That is very nearly the whole of the surviving matter, and from it, the entire case must be reconstructed, every reader assembling the same small stack into the same unfinished shape. The woman it concerns weighed a life at a few pounds. The record that remains of her would not fill a folder, and yet within that thin stack is held one of the plainest tests a society ever set itself and failed to pass to its own satisfaction. The test of being certain, before it killed, that it understood the person it was killing. The paper does not raise its voice. It states the licence that could not be paid for, the premium of 3p, the cake, the ward, the postmark, the 2 hours, the 3 days in the house, the refused week, and the morning at the gate. And it states them in the order they occurred and in the flat language of the record, and it stops where the facts stop. It does not tell the reader what to feel, and it does not pretend to know what it does not. It preserves, and it declines to conclude, and in a case built entirely upon a doubt that was never resolved, that declining is not a weakness of the record but its final and most exact fidelity to what actually happened.